What is up, everybody? I'm No Lux Given here with your afternoon snap, and today we're going to be talking about this mission right here. Win all 3 locations in one match. I'm going to talk about what decks are bad at completing this mission, the deck that I use to complete it, and some other recommendations. There are 2 ways to complete this mission. Either have a strong enough deck that your opponent is going to retreat the game when you are winning all 3 locations, or come up with a deck that has a surprising way to add a bunch of power to the board on the final turn. The first group of decks that I want to look at actually fits both of these categories. They develop a lot of power throughout the game, and then on those final turns have the opportunity to potentially surprise your opponent with a bunch of power. Those lists are going to be Silver Surfer, Patriot, and Cerebro lists, and Safety Blade from Marvel Snap Zone has done a lot of the legwork here for us. I'm going to leave a link to this article in the video description if you're interested in reading more and checking out any more information on any of these decks in this article about winning all 3 locations in a match. So Silver Surfer, this is a pretty straightforward one. You play a lot of really powerful 3-cost cards like Polaris, Maximus, and Brood, but then you also have the chance to surprise your opponent with Serra and dumping a bunch of power on the final turn with Silver Surfer. One of the other things that is really good about this Silver Surfer deck, as well as likely the Cerebro 2 deck that we are going to look at in a moment, it's the inclusions of both Goose and Storm. Locking your opponent's options are going to help you win some lanes easier, and from there, you can still play your Goose or your Cerebro in your, you can still play your Cerebro in your Goose or your Stormed location, and your opponent is only going to be able to play so much power there anyways, and then you can really focus a lot of power at the other 2 locations, because you do have to win all 3 for this to work, and that is part of the trick for both of these decks, as well as especially the Patriot deck, and I'm going to talk more on this in a second. You will want to tailor your plays. I mean, these are good decks because they're strong, consistent decks as well, so you can play them if you're also trying to climb to that next rank before the end of the season, but do be aware that because these decks have setup cards, Cerebro, Silver Surfer, and the Patriot, typically when you play these decks, you do not win the location that you play your Patriot to, that you play your Cerebro to. So that's just something to keep in mind. These decks are really consistent. You wind up having 24 power in 2 locations, but then the other location is setting up with ongoing abilities that are providing power to those other locations. And I guess on the topic of ongoing abilities, Enchantress did just get a buff, so watch out for that. It is a little bit awkward. Like I said, these decks add a lot of power throughout the rest of the game, which means you'll often have priority going into turn 5, meaning that then you can get Enchantress and lose everything that you've done. Not in the case of Silver Surfer, but in the case of Cerebro and Patriot. Now, like I said, with the Cerebro list and the Silver Surfer list, I do really like the lane lockdown aspects with Storm. Those can help you win those other locations. I also think it's not a crazy idea to include some lane lockdown in a Patriot list. It's not going to be the list that we see featured here, but it's definitely something that you can experiment with. And one other thing that I would say to experiment with, this looks like a pretty straightforward Patriot list. It's actually running a lot of no abilities cards, which is also pretty cool. A lot of really basic cards. I would consider playing the Magic version of the deck, and the reason for that is just more time to draw Onslaught and more time to put. So how this deck typically wants to operate is just go Patriot, Mystique, Onslaught, and Ultron all in one location, and that is 16 power, but that's generally not enough, and Ultron is a lot of power itself. I would just consider having a no abilities card at every location, and the other thing that Magic allows you to do is use Mystique to copy Onslaught, and then you can throw a Patriot there and you get a little bit more, and then you just have like a Wasp at that location or something as well. I've also played like Squirrels and Mysterio in that version of the deck, though Debris is the best one because it does interact with Galactus, so you could just start there, and honestly the rest of the deck seems fine. Just throw in Magic somewhere. So those are some recommendations for consistent decks that also provide tempo and then can come up with a surprising win on the final turn that your opponent might not be prepared for. So even though those decks can have surprising victories, I would still put them in the more consistent camp, right? But this is the total other end of the spectrum. This deck is all about surprising victories. Wong plus Mystique is actually enough to make some people retreat. Some people will respect the incredible power that is Wong plus Mystique. You'll see here with White Tiger, we are able to add a ton of power to the board, but that was actually turn 5. We still have one more turn to go since we Zabu'd out the Wong. And for this final turn, we are going to be waived, so there's not actually that many things that we can do, and I'm just going to play Ironheart. And I talked about being surprising and kind of keeping your opponent on their toes so that they'll stay in it and you'll potentially be able to complete the mission against them. Oftentimes with this deck, with White Tiger and Ironheart, you're keeping yourself on your toes, because I'm not sure if I'm actually going to be able to win this game. I've got no clue what my opponent is actually playing, and this actually brings up another great option that you can play, Deathwave. This is a really, really strong deck that is really consistent in terms of tempo, continually adding power to the board. As we can see, my opponent has a nice little 11 power in Hell's Kitchen. But the really cool thing about the Deathwave deck is how much power it can drop on the final turn of the game. My opponent spent a long time thinking on this one. We are going to activate our Ironheart 4 times, so we'll see where all of these things go and if this is indeed enough to win. But my opponent is able to play 3 cards on the wave turn. Death plus She-Hulk plus Shang-Chi, which we were able to dodge. But the other option that you can play there is Leader, Doctor Doom, Arrow. There's a lot of really great options that can grab surprising victories for you on the final turn, as well as just being a really, really strong and consistent deck. So what my opponent is playing here, I definitely recommend, but if you want to find just some surprising wins so that way you can complete the mission, I also recommend Negative Wong. Some other decks that I wanted to shout out that you can play as well, and I also wanted to talk about some decks that you probably shouldn't play. Play a lot of Galactus on the channel. I've got a bunch of different Galactus lists. Do not play Galactus. Pretty straightforward. You can only win one location when you are typically winning with a Galactus list, so don't do that. Agatha Zoo is an interesting option, mostly because if you are kind of pressed for time, or if you're at work, especially if you're already infinite, this could be a good option. You just keep it on your desk and press the end turn button, and then maybe you'll complete the mission. It does provide a lot of strong tempo, and sometimes you can be winning on turn 4. You can snap, apply some pressure, and maybe complete the mission with this deck. One thing that I wanted to shout out to not play, a deck that I've had a lot of fun with in the past, basically Dracula Apocalypse decks, MODOK decks, decks with Swarm. The reason for this is that these decks typically don't put that much power on the board until the final turn, and when they are going to do so, it's typically pretty telegraphed because they've played some good discard. Your opponent has seen your Swarms and your Apocalypse get discarded several times over. So while this deck is really good at winning all 3 locations, I think the wins are just a little bit too telegraphed that I wouldn't go for it. I definitely would play a Deathwave deck. This is not really like the exact list I'd recommend. This is a pretty old list, a little bit more silly. Haven't updated this in a while, but you could drop like the Moon Girl, Squirrel Girl combination, and then play like Arrow, and Arrow's already in here, but Doctor Doom, Leader, like I said, and make it a little bit more consistent in that capacity, rather than going for like the bigger wins, which those bigger wins, like I said, sometimes those are good, but you want to make sure they're not too telegraphed. There is a little bit of awkwardness sometimes too with Mr. Negative, where people will retreat to the negative, not knowing what you have, but I think a lot of players will stay in it. It's hit or miss. Yeah, your mileage may vary, but actually, the deck that I really wanted to recommend is this one right here, and I do recommend this list card for card, hella consistent. So this is a hella reanimator deck. Hella really good at looking unassuming and then dropping a bunch of power on the final turn. Now it is a little bit random and you might not always win all 3 locations, but oftentimes when the deck is really able to go off, it is able to win all 3 locations. So this is definitely a deck that I would recommend. I played this a bunch over the weekend as well to also complete the second to last mission, which is win games with over 40 total power. You reanimate an Infinite and a Magneto, and there you go. That's 32 power, and Hela is making that 38. So pretty easy to get to over 40 power and grab a win with this deck. And I do think that it is a lot more consistent than people give it credit for. That's why I call it hella consistent. I play Magic and Jubilee to kind of thin the deck down, and then just the best discard cards and the best cards to discard. I think that's going to be it for me today. Hopefully, with some of these tips, you guys are able to complete that mission yourself. Let me know how you do, and if you have any other suggestions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. But for today, that's going to be it for me. Thank you guys very much for watching. I'm No Lux Given. Peace.